These three disturbing road trip horror stories expose the shocking dangers lurking in roadside motels, and they are inspired by terrifying real events. First, a weary trucker trying to sleep is forced to listen to the wet, agonizing sounds of a medical nightmare taking place right through the thin drywall. Next, a desperate couple becomes trapped in a roadside hell when a psychotic manager barricades the building to stop a virus that doesn't exist. And finally, authorities are baffled by a perfectly clean room where a loving family checked in, but simply vanished into thin air. You need to stick around for the final story, because the heartbreaking clue found violently jammed into the door of their buried car reveals the horrifying truth. He thought room 9 was under maintenance, until he heard metal tools clinking through the wall at 2 in the morning, smelled antiseptic in the hallway, and watched a woman with fresh bandages get carried to a white van at sunrise from a clinic that doesn't officially exist. 18 hours on the asphalt changes how a man thinks. Jake was running a long-haul delivery from Albuquerque across the flat, empty stretch of the Oklahoma Panhandle, and his logbook was bleeding red ink. It was late 2014. Deadlines were tight. His eyes felt like they were packed with grit, and his only priority was finding a mattress that didn't have bed bugs. He wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for 6 hours of unconsciousness. Exit signs blurred past until he saw one for a place that looked affordable. He pulled his rig off I-40 and rolled into the lot of a dying motor inn. It was a single-story strip of doors facing a parking lot that had surrendered to weeds and cracked stone years ago. Half the rooms were dark, windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Above the office, a neon vacancy sign fought a losing battle, flickering with a nervous, erratic rhythm that made the shadows jump around the lot. Parking his truck in the back, Jake grabbed his duffel bag. He left the engine idling to keep the oil cycling, a habit from years on the road, and walked toward the office. The air outside was dry and dusty, but inside the office smelled like stale tobacco and lemon cleaner. Behind the counter sat a thin man who looked like he was made of wire and anxiety. Dark circles hung under his eyes. He didn't look at Jake when the door chime rang. He was staring out the front window, his gaze fixed intensely on the dark parking lot. "Need a room?" Jake said, leaning his heavy arms on the laminate counter. "Just a shower and sleep, checking out by 7. Jumping slightly, the clerk snapped his head around. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask for a credit card. He reached under the counter and slapped a metal key down on the formica. "Room 7, the clerk said. His voice was low, hurried. He looked back out the window again. "You want this one. Don't go near 9. It's, under maintenance." Frowning, Jake looked at the key. He wasn't the type to ask questions he didn't need answers to, but the guy was acting strange. "Maintenance? At this hour?" "Just take the key, man," the clerk muttered, sliding a registration card across the desk. "Room 7. Park around the side." Signing his name, Jake glanced past the clerk's shoulder. The reflection in the window behind the desk gave him a clear view of the motel strip outside. He saw room 7, dark and uninviting. 2 doors down was room 9. The curtains there twitched. A light inside snapped on, harsh and white, spilling out onto the concrete walkway. That wasn't what caught Jake's attention, though. It was the vehicle backed right up to the door of room 9. In a lot full of rusted sedans and Jake's road-weary rig, this vehicle stood out. It was a cargo van, stark white and absolutely spotless. No logos on the side, no license plate frame. It looked brand new, or at least washed within the last hour. It was too clean for a place this dirty. The rear doors were backed up, almost touching the door of room 9, creating a privacy screen that blocked any view from the rest of the lot. Jake took the key and walked back out into the night. He grabbed his bag from the truck and headed for his room. As he passed room 9, he paused. The engine of that white van was off, but the hood was warm. He felt a gut instinct telling him to get back in his truck and drive another 50 miles, but his legs were heavy and the promise of a mattress was too strong. He unlocked the door to room 7, threw the deadbolt, and collapsed onto the bed. Room 7 was exactly what he paid for: cheap, musty, and cool. The air conditioner unit mounted under the window rattled and shook, filling the space with white noise. Jake, used to sleeping through the noise of highway traffic, found the sound comforting. He closed his eyes, ignoring the weird vibes from next door. Around 1:30 in the morning, the rhythm of the night broke. Jake woke up. He didn't wake up slowly. His eyes snapped open, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The air conditioner was still rattling away, but underneath that mechanical noise, there was something else. A sound coming through the wall right next to his head. The wall he shared with room 9. Low moaning drifted through the plaster. It wasn't the sound of a TV. It wasn't the sound of two people having a good time. It was a distressed noise, wet and desperate. It sounded like someone biting down on a towel to keep from screaming. Sitting up, Jake swung his legs over the side of the bed. The carpet under his feet was thin and worn. He leaned closer to the wall, pressing his ear against the cheap drywall. Clink. Distinct and sharp, the sound cut through the silence, metal hitting metal. Crisp. It sounded exactly like a mechanic setting a wrench down on a steel table, but lighter, more delicate, like instruments on a tray. Clink, clink. Voices came next. A male voice, calm but firm. It was professional, completely lacking in warmth. "You're okay. Breathe. You signed the papers, remember?" Standing up, the hair on Jake's arms rose. He walked to the door of his room, moving as quietly as a big man could. He didn't open it. He just stood there, waiting. Then it hit him. A smell drifted under the gap of the door, or maybe it seeped through the cracks in the wall itself. Chemicals filled his nose. Powerful chemicals. It smelled like bleach, but sharper. Industrial antiseptic. The kind of stuff that burns your sinuses when you walk into a hospital ward being scrubbed down. But mixed in with that sterile sting was something else, something heavy and metallic. It smelled like a handful of old copper pennies. Jake knew that smell from years of seeing accidents on the highway. It was the smell of blood. Cracking the door open just an inch, Jake peered out. The nervous clerk was there. He was standing by the door to room 9, looking left and right. He tapped on the door. A second man opened it. This guy was wearing scrubs. Not a doctor's coat, just cheap green surgical scrubs that looked like they had been bought at a surplus store. He wasn't wearing a mask yet, and his face was hard, focused. He was dragging a portable oxygen tank on a trolley and carrying a heavy stained duffel bag. "Hurry up," the man in scrubs hissed. "We're on a clock." Pulling away from the door, Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He went to his side window, the one that looked out toward the van. He carefully peeled back the edge of the curtain, just a fraction of an inch. Curtains in room 9 weren't fully closed. Through a gap no wider than a finger, Jake saw inside. Furniture had been pushed against the walls. In the center of the room, under a bright, portable work light clamped to the curtain rod, was a folding table. It was covered in a plastic sheet. On a smaller tray next to it, Jake saw the source of the clinking sound. A row of silver instruments glinting under the harsh bulb. Scalpels, clamps, syringes. Things that had no business being in a roadside motel room. He saw a shadow moving on the table. An arm hanging off the side, limp. A short, choked cry came through the wall. "You move, you bleed," the cold voice said. "Hold still." Then came a sound that made Jake's skin crawl, the sound of heavy adhesive tape being ripped off a roll. Ripe. Then the crinkle of plastic, and finally, a low mechanical sucking sound, a portable suction machine. Jake sat there in the dark. He felt completely useless. He was in the middle of the panhandle. The nearest sheriff was probably 30 miles away. The clerk was clearly involved. He was isolated, listening to a human being get cut open on a folding table 10 feet away. He just stared at the wall, imagining the scene on the other side. Hours passed. The sounds went on, the suction, the clinking, the low murmurs. Jake didn't sleep. He couldn't. He just sat there, a witness in the dark. Eventually the sounds changed. Zippers closing, Velcro tearing. The whimpering had stopped a long time ago. Morning light began to paint the sky gray. At 7 a.m., Jake was dressed, his bag packed. He needed to be back on the road, away from room 9. He opened his door and stepped out into the morning air. At that exact moment, the door to room 9 opened. First, the man in scrubs stepped out. He looked tired now, wiping his hands on a rag. Then the clerk stepped out. Between them, they were supporting a woman. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was the color of ash. She was wearing a gray, oversized sweatshirt that swallowed her small frame. She was hunched over, walking with small, painful shuffles, pressing one hand firmly against her abdomen. On her left arm, Jake saw a piece of white medical tape holding down a cotton ball, right where an IV would go. In her other hand, she gripped a white plastic grocery bag. It was translucent. Jake could see the orange plastic of pill bottles inside, and shoved down at the bottom of the bag was a wad of gauze, stained a bright, alarming red. Guiding her to the back of the clean white van, the men lifted her onto the floor of the cargo area. She didn't say a word. She just looked at the floor, her eyes glazed and distant. The man in scrubs hopped in the driver's seat. The van started up, a quiet, well-tuned engine, and pulled out of the lot without stopping at the office. Walking toward his truck, Jake stopped at the dumpster near the edge of the lot. He didn't want to look, but he had to know. He lifted the heavy black lid. Trash filled the bottom, mostly fast food bags, but sitting right on top was a red plastic bag. It was tied tight at the top with a distinct knot. The plastic was thick, but Jake could see the shapes inside. Coiled plastic tubing, latex gloves, empty vials, and more of those heavy, blood-soaked pads. Looking back at the concrete outside room 9, he saw it, a faint rust-colored stain on the threshold. Something had dripped there. Someone had tried to wipe it up, but the stain remained. Jake walked into the office to drop off his key. The clerk was back behind the desk, reading a newspaper like nothing had happened. He looked up as Jake put the key on the counter. "What exactly was going on in room 9?" Jake asked, his voice rough. Shrugging, the clerk didn't look scared anymore. He looked bored. "People can't afford hospitals," he said, turning a page of his paper. "Doc gives them a deal. In and out in one night." He looked up at Jake, his eyes dead flat. "They sign consent forms. They pay cash. They walk out. Nobody's forcing them. You got a bed and a key, right? That's all this place promises." Staring at him for a long second, Jake turned and walked out. He climbed into his rig, fired up the diesel engine, and drove. He didn't stop for 400 miles. Weeks later, he was eating lunch at a truck stop in Arkansas, scrolling through news on his phone. He saw a headline that made his blood freeze. It was an online expose about black market medical rings. The article detailed how unlicensed practitioners were setting up mobile clinics in cheap motels along interstate routes. It talked about cut rate surgeries and cosmetic procedures done on folding tables. It mentioned patients showing up in ERS septic, dying from infections days later. Authorities described the setup: unmarked white vans, cash-only payments, motels used as temporary operating rooms. And there was a photo, a grainy picture of a motel exterior that looked exactly like the one off I-40. Same curtain style, same cracked pavement. Jake put his phone down. He realized then that he had slept one wall away from a black market operating room. That pale woman in the sweatshirt might be dead now, rotting from an infection she caught in a dirty room off an exit ramp. And the clinic? It was gone. It moves. It operates in the shadows of the highway system. Tonight, somewhere else, room 9 is under maintenance, and someone just like you is sleeping on the other side of the wall, listening to the clink of metal, wondering if they should turn up the TV or call for help that won't come in time. They thought the motel's 11 p.m. lockdown was just extra security, until the manager's voice came over the speakers calling them contaminants, and a dad's spider bite was all it took for a germ-obsessed psychopath to trap a whole motel for the night. The year was 2020, and the great American road trip had changed. It wasn't about freedom anymore. It was about escape. The highways were emptier, the towns were quieter, and everyone looked at travelers with suspicion. For Sarah and Ben, the drive from California to Texas was supposed to be a reset, but by the time they hit the New Mexico desert, it felt more like an endurance test. The inside of their car was a mess of empty energy drink cans and crumpled fast food wrappers, the debris of 2 days spent living at 70 miles per hour. Their backs ached from the seats. Their eyes burned from staring at the endless, hypnotic white lines of the highway. They were in that strange, floaty state of exhaustion you only get after 12 hours of driving, where reality feels a little thin. They were currently in a dead zone. The GPS on the dashboard was spinning, trying to find a signal in the vast, empty scrubland. The cell phone bars had dropped to 1, then 0. Then back to a mocking 1 bar that couldn't actually load a web page. This was a bumfuck area, the kind of place where if you broke down, you were truly on your own. When the neon sign of the roadside motel flickered into view, it looked like an oasis. It was remote, sitting alone in the dust like a forgotten prop from an old movie. Sarah didn't care that the paint was peeling. She didn't care that it was miles from the nearest town. She just wanted to stop moving. They pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. There were maybe 10 or 12 other cars parked there, trucks coated in dust, sedans packed with luggage. They weren't the only ones trying to cross the desert. Ahead of them, in the small, brightly lit lobby, was a family of 4. A dad named Mike, a mom named Laura, and 2 kids who looked like they had been sleeping in the back seat for days. Sarah and Ben stood behind them, stretching their stiff legs, desperate for a key and a bed. But as soon as they stepped inside, the smell hit them. It wasn't the smell of road dust or stale coffee. It was bleach, sharp, chemical, and overpowering. It stung the inside of Sarah's nose. The lobby didn't smell like a place to rest. It smelled like a hospital ward. Behind the counter stood the manager. His name tag read Walter. He was a gaunt man, maybe in his late 40s, with skin that looked like it hadn't seen the sun in years. But it was his eyes that were scary. They were intense, unblinking, and focused. He was wearing blue latex gloves and a mask, even though he was safe behind a thick glass partition. The lobby was covered in handwritten signs. They were taped to the glass, the walls, and the counter in aggressive black marker. No sick guests. If you're ill, leave. And the biggest one, right in front of Mike's face: we reserve the right to refuse service for health reasons. Walter wasn't looking at Mike's credit card. He was staring at Mike's arm. Mike was scratching a red, swollen bump on his forearm. It looked angry, the skin puffed up around the center. Walter leaned in, his voice flat and weirdly clinical. "How long have you had that rash?" Mike stopped scratching, looking confused. "What? Oh, dude, I got bit by a spider earlier. We stopped at a rest stop a few hours back. It's nothing." Walter didn't relax. He didn't smile. He stared at the bite like it was a biohazard. "Any fever?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Chills? Any more spots anywhere else on your body?" Mike let out a tired, nervous laugh. "No, man. Seriously, it's just a spider bite. We've been in the car all day. I'm fine." Walter didn't laugh back. He slowly typed on his keyboard, his gloved fingers making a wet, rubbery sound. He was acting less like a hotel clerk and more like a solo health enforcer. A man waging a private war against germs in the middle of the desert. When Mike and his family left with their keys, Walter turned his intense gaze to Sarah and Ben. He processed their card quickly, but before he handed over the key, he gave them a warning that felt more like a threat. "We lock all exterior doors at 11 p.m. for security," Walter said. His eyes locked onto Ben's. "If you go out, use the side exit, and do not let strangers in." Sarah and Ben were too tired to argue. They just nodded, grabbed their bags, and headed to their room. They brushed it off as small-town paranoia. They figured Walter was just a lonely guy taking his job too seriously. They were wrong. The room was sparse and cold. Sarah checked her phone again. No service. She tossed it onto the nightstand. They were cut off from the world, isolated in the deep silence of the desert. They collapsed into bed, the road hum still vibrating in their legs. At 11:05 p.m., the sound began. It wasn't a soft click. It was a heavy mechanical thunk, then another. Clang, click, thud. It echoed down the long exterior walkway. It sounded like heavy steel deadbolts being thrown home on metal doors. It sounded like a prison going into lockdown. Outside, the lobby lights went dark. The closed sign flipped. But the parking lot was full. Everyone was still inside. At first, it was just annoying. Sarah heard a guest down the hall open their room door and step into the hallway. She heard the rattle of the handle on the side exit. Then, a frustrated sigh. Then, the sound of a shoulder slamming against the door. Wham! The door didn't open. "Hey!" the guest yelled, his voice muffled by the walls. "It's stuck!" Ben sat up, groggy. "What is that?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered. She felt a sudden cold spike of adrenaline. She went to their door and peered into the hallway. The emergency lights were buzzing. She went to the window. She pulled back the stiff, heavy curtains and tried to slide the glass pane open to get some fresh air. It wouldn't move. She frowned and looked closer at the aluminum frame. There were fresh screws driven into the track. The window was bolted shut. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in your stomach and spreads to your fingers. Sarah looked around the room. She looked for the emergency exit map, the one with the red arrows that is supposed to be on the back of every hotel door. The wall was bare. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling, "we can't get out." They grabbed their phones, they held them up to the window, desperate for a signal. One bar flickered for a second. Ben tried to dial out. Chirp, chirp. The phone tried to connect, then dead silence. The call dropped before it even rang. They were trapped. They were miles from civilization, in a building they couldn't escape, with no way to call for help. The road trip had turned into a cage. Around midnight, a burst of static made them both jump. It came from an old yellowed PA speaker mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Walter's voice filled the room. It wasn't shouting. It was perfectly flat, clinical. "Attention all guests. The property is now under temporary quarantine." Sarah grabbed Ben's hand. Her palms were sweating. "We have observed possible infectious lesions on one male subject," Walter continued, his voice echoing in the small room. "No one is allowed to leave their rooms until I determine it is safe." He didn't mention the police. He didn't mention the health department. There was no siren wailing in the distance. This was just Walter, a man with a master key and a delusion, deciding he was the judge, jury, and warden. Then he made it worse. He turned the guests against each other. "Primary subject is located in room 112, Walter announced. "Do not approach. Do not open your doors to them. They are a biological risk." Room 112. That was Mike and his family. The reaction was instant. Other guests, already scared and trapped, started shouting through the thin walls. Sarah heard someone pounding on the sheetrock next to Mike's room.
"Get out of here!"
a voice screamed.
"You're getting us all sick!"
"It's a spider bite," Mike yelled back, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "He's crazy! Let us out!" But Walter didn't let them out. This wasn't a quick scare. This was a slow, suffocating ordeal that lasted the entire night. For 10 hours, Sarah and Ben sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of their captor patrolling the building. The motel was only one story, so the walkway was right outside their bolted window. Every 20 minutes, they would hear it. Scrape, step, scrape. Walter was walking the perimeter. Then a hiss. Tss. He was spraying disinfectant on the doorknobs. He was muttering to himself, a low, rambling monologue that drifted through the glass. "They always lie. People lie about symptoms. I have to hold the line. I have to keep it clean." The proximity was terrifying. He wasn't a monster under the bed. He was a man just inches away, convinced he was saving the world. Every time his shadow passed the curtain, Sarah held her breath, praying he wouldn't try to come in to check them. Morning brought the sun, but no relief. The desert heat began to bake the room. The air conditioner just recycled the stale, chemical-smelling air. By 10 a.m., the tension finally snapped. From down the hall in room 112, Sarah heard a massive crash. Thud. It sounded like furniture being thrown. "Help us!" Laura screamed. "Somebody help!" Thud. Mike and Laura were fighting back. They had dragged a heavy armchair to the front window and were ramming it into the reinforced glass. Crack. The sound of splintering glass was sharp and violent. Smash. Sarah ran to her window and peeked through the slit in the curtains. She saw a hand, bloody from the shards, thrust out through the broken window of room 112. It was holding a cell phone, pushing it out into the open air, desperate for a signal that wasn't blocked by the thick motel walls. They got through. They dialed 911 and explained the insane reality. They were hostages in a roadside motel, trapped by a man playing doctor. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they didn't knock. They used a battering ram on the lobby doors. The sound of the breach echoed through the complex like a cannon shot. Sarah and Ben watched from their window as the deputies dragged Walter out into the gravel parking lot. He wasn't fighting physically, but he was screaming. He wasn't screaming for a lawyer. He was screaming about the infection. "They're contaminated," Walter yelled, his face twisted in a mask of self-righteous fury. "You're letting it out. I was protecting the public." He truly believed it. Even as they cuffed him, even as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, he looked at the guests stumbling out of their rooms not with guilt, but with disgust. The police used bolt cutters to open the side exits. The guests poured out into the blinding daylight, blinking, exhausted and traumatized. Mike stood by his car, hugging his wife and kids, his arms still swollen from the spider bite. Just a spider bite, nothing more. The lockdown was over. Sarah and Ben got back into their car, the interior still filled with the trash from the day before. They sped onto the highway, putting miles between them and the motel. But the road trip didn't feel the same after that. The freedom of the open road felt different. Because the scariest part wasn't the locked doors. It wasn't the bolted windows. It was the realization of how vulnerable you are when you are just passing through. When you are on the road, you are at the mercy of strangers. You trust the cook not to poison the food. You trust the other drivers to stay in their lane. And you trust the man at the front desk to give you a key and keep you safe. But in the middle of nowhere, when the sun goes down and the cell service dies, how do you really know? How do you know if the rules they are enforcing are real or just the architecture of their own madness? Next time you check into a lonely motel and hear the lock click shut, just make sure you can open it again. A family of 3 pulled off the highway for one cheap night of sleep. But when housekeeping opened their door the next morning, the beds were still made, the toothbrushes were still wet, and the only thing missing was the people. Roadside motels like the one off that lonely rural stretch of US Highway 281 are supposed to be safe havens. They are pit stops, temporary shields against the long, dark miles that cut through the central Texas darkness. But for one family in the spring of 1996, that small, independent motel became a trap. It became a wall with a window, and something was looking in. It was around 8:30 in the evening when the blue SUV crunched over the gravel of the parking lot. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of heavy Texas heat that sticks to your skin even after the sun goes down. Inside the car was a family of 3, exhausted from the endless miles of a cross-country road trip. Austin was the dad, a man in his late 30s who worked as an auto mechanic. His hands were strong, but his eyes were heavy, worn down by staring at the white lines of 281 for too long. Rachel was the mom, a nurse in her mid-30s. She was tired too, but she still had that sharp, watchful energy that mothers never fully turn off. And then there was Savannah. She was 6 years old, and she was the only one with any energy left. Austin walked into the office to check in. The night clerk remembers him clearly, not because Austin did anything strange, but because of the specific request he made. Austin asked for a ground floor unit, and he was adamant about privacy. He asked specifically for a quiet room away from the road, as far from the office and the highway noise as they could get. While he was signing the register, the clerk watched Savannah discover the ice machine in the corner of the lobby. She started jumping around, excited like she'd just been given a pony, not a plastic cup of shaved ice. It was a normal, relatable family moment. That normalcy is exactly what makes the rest of this story feel so wrong. The clerk gave them the key to room 14. It was the end unit, the farthest door down the row. It was exactly what Austin had asked for, isolated. The back window didn't look out onto the parking lot. It faced a dark, overgrown field of tall grass that bled into the dense woods. They drove the SUV down to the end of the row and parked. They carried their bags inside. The heavy door clicked shut, and the lock turned. For a while, the sounds coming from room 14 were the sounds of safety, the squeak of the bathroom fan, the low murmur of the television news, the muffled sound of Savannah giggling. These are the noises you ignore because they mean life is happening. A woman staying 2 doors down in room 16 was the only witness to the change. She was reading in bed, the silence of the motel pressing in around her. At exactly 10:45 p.m., she heard the first sign of the intrusion. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't the sound of breaking glass or a struggle. It was a single loud thump. It sounded dense and heavy, like a piece of luggage dropped from a height, or a body hitting the floor dead weight. The sound was sharp, abrupt, and completely alone. The woman in room 16 paused, holding her breath, waiting for the follow-up. She expected to hear an apology, a voice, maybe a child crying, but there was nothing. The silence that followed swallowed the thump whole. The motel's night settled back into the low hum of the air conditioning units, and the crickets chirped in the field behind room 14 as if nothing had happened. The next morning, the Texas sun came up hot and bright. Housekeeping started their rounds on a tight schedule. When the maid reached the end of the row, she knocked on the door of room 14. She waited. She knocked again, louder this time. Still, there was no answer. Assuming the family had left early to get back on the road, she pulled the master key from her belt and opened the door. The room was neat. It was too neat. The curtains were drawn tight, letting in only a sickly gray light. The TV was off. The lights were off. The maid stepped inside, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the thin carpet. The beds were perfectly made, the pillows fluffed and smooth. The towels in the bathroom were folded on the rack. It looked exactly like a room waiting for a guest to check in, not one that had just been slept in. She walked to the dresser. Sitting right there, placed neatly next to the Bible, was the room key. They had left it behind, but if they had checked out, they would have dropped it at the office. And if they had left, where was their car? The parking spot in front of room 14 was empty. Austin's blue SUV was gone. The police arrived quickly, but they started the investigation with a simple, logical theory. The family had an emergency, packed in a rush, and simply forgot a few things. It happens all the time. People get bad news, they panic, they leave. But room 14 refused that simple explanation. As the police moved through the quiet room, the details began to curdle the normalcy into something profoundly uncanny. In the bathroom, the officer found 3 toothbrushes standing in the cup by the sink. Austin's, Rachel's, and Savannah's small, bright-colored one. He leaned in close. The bristles were wet, not damp from the day before. They were fresh wet. Water droplets still clung to the plastic. It was as if the family had brushed their teeth, set them down, and vanished into the air seconds later. Then they looked at the bed. Sitting on Savannah's pillow was her stuffed animal, a worn-out gray rabbit. It wasn't tossed on the floor or kicked under the sheets. It was placed there with care. No 6-year-old girl leaves her most cherished possession behind. And finally, tucked into the closet, they found Rachel's purse. Inside, her identification and all of her cash were untouched. People do not flee an emergency without their money. People do not leave without their identity. The physical evidence told a story of ordinary people preparing for an ordinary night of sleep who were violently, instantly interrupted by something that left no trace. The search yielded nothing. The motel was checked, the road was canvassed, missing persons reports were filed for Austin, Rachel, and Savannah. But the local police were overwhelmed, unable to shake the feeling of profound wrongness, but lacking any evidence of a crime. No blood, no struggle, no forced entry. They eventually let the case go cold. They dismissed it as a voluntary disappearance. They told themselves the family wanted to start over, ignoring the mounting dread of the wet toothbrushes and the untouched purse. For 6 weeks, there was only silence. Then the final chilling piece of evidence was unearthed. A hunter was working deep in the woods, about 20 miles away from the motel. He was walking along a dry creek bed, a desolate place far from the main roads. He stumbled across a shape that didn't belong in the wild. It was Austin's blue SUV. The vehicle wasn't just parked, it was buried. It had been driven into the depression of the creek bed, and someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. Branches, dead brush, and old logs had been intentionally, meticulously piled over the hood and windshield to conceal it from the air. The police arrived and swept the vehicle. There were no signs of a crash. There was no blood inside. There were no bodies. But the person who hid the car wanted to make sure it and the family could never be traced. The VIN number on the dashboard had been roughly scraped off, gouged out of the metal and plastic. But it was the back seat that held the true horror of the story. Stuck in the rear passenger door was a piece of fabric. It was Savannah's baby blanket. It was wedged violently into the crack between the door and the frame. It hadn't been dropped. It had been pulled. The fabric was ripped and frayed, caught tight as the heavy metal door was slammed shut on it. That small, torn scrap of cloth was the wordless testimony to a desperate, violent end. It was the only sign of chaos in a disappearance that had been so terrifyingly quiet. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Who intercepted a family in a locked motel room without making a sound? Who drove their car 20 miles into the woods, scraped the VIN, and buried it, only to leave no other trace? The investigation failed. No bodies were ever recovered. Austin, Rachel, and Savannah had simply ceased to exist. The case file became a thick binder full of theories and dead ends, sitting on a shelf in a dusty evidence room. Today, if you were to visit that small motel off Highway 281, you would not find room 14. The owners quietly renumbered the units. They pretended that space, the end unit that faces the overgrown dark field, never existed. They tried to erase the history to keep the customers coming. But the truth is, a family of 3 pulled off the highway for one cheap night of sleep. And sometimes, if the wind is blowing just right and you are standing in that dark corner of the lot, you can almost hear the soft, faint sound of a little girl laughing near the silent, empty place where the ice machine used to be.